Hello, friends. I hope you're happy and well wherever you are in the world today. Most of you have probably already heard that legal cannabis is one of the most rapidly growing industries in the world today. In North America alone, the ArcView Market Report predicts that legal cannabis sales will jump from $9.2 billion last year to $47.3 billion in 2024. Add in the rest of the world, and that estimate jumps to $57 billion. This rapid growth has led some people to compare legal cannabis to the telecommunications or internet booms. But I think it's more like the falling of the Berlin Wall or the opening of China to international trade. The internet and telecom followed the traditional trajectory of a developing industry, from basic science to research and development of usable products, and then more research to determine the optimal product to market fit, followed by a long period of public education and an incremental rollout, starting with early adopters and eventually building to mass marketing. It's a process that takes several years and sometimes several decades, and almost always plays out beyond the reach of average citizens and small business people. This incremental and private development means that by the time the general public sees products in the marketplace, the basic standards, ethics, and culture of most new industries are already well established. With few exceptions, there's no meaningful opportunity for regular citizens or investors or entrepreneurs to weigh in on new industries until the mold is already set. The legal cannabis industry is different. It's born in an instant with the stroke of a pen, in full view of the public eye, the result of a political process like a voter initiative or the passage of reform legislation. Decades of industrial development aren't necessary because human beings have been making things out of cannabis and consuming cannabis for as long as we've been human. All it takes is the lifting of prohibition. And we're living through that moment right now. And the standards, the ethics, the culture of the industry are still being formed. There's a multitude of voices as varied as Dan Blazarian and Martha Stewart and Steve D'Angelo, offering different images of what it might become. And as more states and countries legalize, each jurisdiction presents what they see as the best framework for regulation. What works and what doesn't, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, are still being debated. And people who are usually voiceless, consumers and small investors and entrepreneurs, have a wide array of opportunities to influence what is becoming a major global industry. And those opportunities, they come at just about every step in the process of legalization. They include drafting and campaigning for voter initiatives, testifying at hearings and public comment periods, lobbying for cannabis reform legislation at every level of government, municipal, county, state, and federal. They include the additional hearings, white papers, and stockholder testimony that will be needed to write up the regulations implementing those laws. And the public hearings for the granting or renewal of specific cannabis licenses, and the heavy news and social media coverage of the whole debate. It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance for regular people to mold the shape of a new industry. And we all get to ask a question that's normally reserved for corporate boards and institutional investors. If you could build an industry exactly the way you wanted it, what would it look like? The earliest pioneers of the legal industry, people like Dennis Perrone and Debbie Goldsberry and Jack Herrera and me, came to this question from a place of deep love and close relationship with the plant. We saw cannabis more as a teacher than as a commodity, and we took the lessons she taught us seriously. So when some of us were finally able to open the very first legal cannabis businesses, the lessons we learned from the plant guided our way. We built a culture of radical inclusion and an economy based on sharing and compassion. We baked sustainability, diversity, fairness, activism, and social justice into our business models. Most of us early pioneers were white people. We were coming from a place of relative privilege. Had we been black, we probably never would have gotten away with what we were doing. We already viewed the world through a lens of radical critique, but our vision was fogged by the myopia that comes from growing up in a society that practices systematic racism. Well, the fog began to clear as we engaged with patients and staff from communities of color, other marginalized populations, as we became friends and comrades in a common struggle, as we built relationships of trust and love across the boundaries that separate most Americans. And as we early pioneers woke, one of the first and most obvious things we noticed was the whiteness of the new industry we were building. And this growing consciousness was reinforced by the ethic of towns like Berkeley and Oakland, which were the first to license cannabis dispensaries and where a commitment to racial justice has long been recognized as a core community value. By around 2012, the lack of diversity was being discussed at cannabis industry events like the ArcView conference. By 2015, we began to see people of color within the industry launch social equity advocacy organizations like the Minority Cannabis Business Association and Supernova Women. They had the specific mission of building more diversity into the industry. And in 2016, Ebele Ifedigbo and Lanice Martin launched the very first business incubator designed specifically for people of color, the Hood Incubator that was in my hometown of Oakland, California. And in a really brilliant step of organizing, this new generation of cannabis activists amplified the equity conversation. They refused to take no for an answer. And their relentless demands for greater opportunity in the legal industry resonated throughout the community, were eventually heard by the City Council of Oakland, which in 2017 became the first jurisdiction anywhere to enact social equity provisions into their cannabis licensing programs. Since then, Oakland's pioneering example, along with the public outrage resulting from the murder of George Floyd and the growing awareness of the racial disparities in law enforcement, has inspired many other cities and states and even foreign countries to include social equity provisions in their licensing programs. Michigan, Washington, Nevada, Oregon, Colorado, several other states number among them. In Massachusetts, all delivery licenses are reserved exclusively for social equity companies. In Mexico, 40% of all cannabis licenses have been reserved for indigenous communities. In Thailand, traditional healers have been promised a role in the industry, and similar efforts to promote inclusivity are being discussed all around the world. And we've just scraped the surface of what's possible. What could we do if we really stretch our imaginations and audacity? If we really listen to the lessons the plant teaches us? The opportunities are almost endless. One of the most vexing problems facing human societies is an ever-increasing disparity of income, with a small slice of the world's population controlling most of its resources, while billions of other people struggle just to meet the bare demands of daily existence. It's a problem that cannabis speaks to for those who listen carefully. Think about a circle of people smoking a joint. When another person comes up to the edge of the circle doesn't close up to exclude them. It expands to welcome them and to share the joint. And it doesn't matter how unusual or different or even weird that person is. And if the newcomer is cold or hungry, most likely they're going to be offered warmth and food. And this spirit of inclusion and generosity, it's a universal phenomenon, common to cannabis consumers everywhere. It's just who we are. And now, today, we have an opportunity to massively scale up this spirit of inclusion and generosity, to embed it deep in the bones of the new industry, to enable people who come from families that have never owned anything to have a real shot at prosperity. Now, one way to do that is with executive compensation limits, like they do at Dr. Bronner's, where the highest paid executive can't make any more than 5 times the compensation received by the lowest paid employee. Another step that just about any cannabis company could and should take is to implement robust profit sharing with employees so they can share in the success that they're helping to build. And for the really bold and audacious, there's this idea of creating employee-owned and managed cannabis companies. I haven't seen it done with cannabis yet, but groups of cannabis workers could each contribute a small amount of capital, build whatever kind of management structure they like, and if they're successful, divide the profits equally. And my guess is that worker-owned enterprises could successfully organize to secure licensing preferences, just like those won by social equity activists. And collectively, these steps could produce an industry that spreads the wealth more widely than any that's come before it, and actually really makes an impact on global income disparity. Paying careful attention to the size of cultivation footprints is also important. Everything starts with the plant. Large-scale cultivation attracts large-scale finance, and those sources of financing tend to prefer large law firms, large distributors, large manufacturers, large marketing companies, and large advertising budgets, leaving not much room for family farmers, craft manufacturers, or ancillary companies. If we want to avoid this outcome, then we have to reasonably limit the size of cannabis grows and the number of grows that can be owned by any one entity. A quick look at Oregon and Florida illustrates this point. Legalization in Oregon was the result of a broad-based, decades-long, incredibly energetic grassroots movement. It came from the bottom up, and its licensing structure spreads opportunity widely. Oregon's licensed thousands of growers, limits the size of commercial cannabis gardens to a maximum of 40,000 square feet, and created licenses for each step of the supply chain. This structure has made it possible for small legacy growers to have a place in the legal industry. It's given birth to a wide range of small support companies and manufacturers. It's given families that have always worked for a wage an opportunity to become business owners. And it's produced some of the best cannabis at some of the lowest countries, at some of the lowest prices in the country. In Florida, the brutality of state and local law enforcement and the corruption of the courts have long suppressed most grassroots activism. Reform in Florida was a top-down process. It was largely organized and financed by the uber-successful attorney and cannabis advocate, John Morgan. And we should all be grateful to John. But the lack of a broad-based movement of small stakeholders allowed the state to launch what may be the most inequitable model of cannabis regulation seen thus far. Florida licensed only 7 vertically integrated companies. Each was allowed to grow, process, distribute, manufacture, and retail an unlimited amount of cannabis at an unlimited number of locations. This was a great structure for the already wealthy families and publicly traded companies who paid millions of dollars to acquire these super licenses. but the law constricted opportunity instead of spreading it. There are no small growers or manufacturers or retailers in Florida. There are no families becoming owners for the first time, and very few small companies providing transport or testing or processing services. And for consumers, this concentration of ownership has brought relatively low-quality cannabis at high prices. And it should serve as a cautionary tale. If we, the people, fail to seize this small window of opportunity to spread cannabis prosperity broadly, the same forces that have dominated the economy for generations will be all too happy to claim it for themselves. Now, some people think that's already a foregone conclusion, but I don't think so. Take a look at British Columbia in Canada. It's a case study. The regulations there initially favored large corporate players and left most of the deep legacy grower community out of the legal system. But over the course of the last few years, that community has organized, they've put significant pressure on their elected representatives, and now the result, the province just announced that small growers will be allowed to sell directly into retailers and to make farm gate sales right on their own property. Now, this is a great example of a cannabis regulation that will help us spread prosperity more widely. And it should be a standard part of every legal cannabis system everywhere in the world. Now, another one of our most urgent global challenges is the climate crisis. And the lessons we learn from cannabis should inform our behavior here too. Almost every cannabis consumer I talk to can tell me a story about being in a park or a garden or hanging out with animal friends and having a magic moment, a moment of appreciation for nature, a realization of how precious it all is. Well, these moments are more about than just being high. We should take them seriously. We should understand them as messages from Mother Earth. We should understand them as an urgent call to action. Fossil-based economies and an insatiable desire for growth have already poisoned our air and water and food. They've already destroyed and disrupted the habitats of thousands of other creatures, and the industrial machine we've built now threatens to drive us ourselves to extinction. Cannabis may be the most viable way to control and reverse this damage to our planet. Anything made out of petroleum or trees or cotton or concrete can instead be made out of hemp. And 20 tons of atmospheric carbon is sequestered with every hectare that's harvested. On top of that, cannabis has this powerful ability to halt erosion and clean up contaminated soil. It was first used for that purpose at the Chernobyl nuclear site. And since then, it's been used successfully on many types of industrial pollutants. Well, our new industry should take full advantage of hemp and other eco-friendly inputs. Our energy sources should be non-polluting and renewable. Our packaging should be compostable. Our waste should be transformed into usable products. Totally possible. One thing I just heard recently shows how possible it is. The development of carbon nanosheets made from cannabis crop waste. They're more efficient supercapacitors than graphene. And now there's companies looking at using these nanosheets to skin cars and airplanes and houses, right? Turning them into giant solar collectors. Agricultural policy also presents possibilities. The federal government of the United States paid farmers more than $22 billion in subsidies in 2019. Most of that money went to support non-organic and animal-based products that contribute to global warming. Some of those subsidies, probably the majority of them, should be redirected towards promoting cannabis agriculture. Farmers could be rewarded for planting hemp on contaminated land and eroded land to restore it. And in places suffering from bee colony collapse, where Hemp can provide foraging bees with a late season source of nutrition and extend their lifespan after all the other crops have gone out of bloom. That's right. In addition to all of its other benefits, hemp can also help save the bees. So how cool would it be to see a big sign in Times Square showing a countdown of hemp being grown worldwide and the corresponding amount of carbon being removed from the atmosphere? Maybe even include an estimate of the number of bees being saved. And at the state level, and in other countries, traditional sun and soil growers whose environmental impact is a small fraction of indoor growers should be protected with appellations of origin, just like we do with wine and cheese. Their eco-friendly methods should be incentivized with appropriate tax and licensing benefits. And states could and should also mandate diverse representation on cannabis corporate boards. California already requires all corporate boards to have at least one female member, and we should take it much, much further. These goals are lofty, but they're not impossible. Some of them require government action, but many could be accomplished by an enlightened industry acting on its own, independently of any requirements or mandates. That's what the pioneers of this industry, like Dennis Perone and Debbie Goldsberry and I, did. We were way too far locked in struggle with the government to trust it with such an important mission. But times have changed. The governments we battled for decades are beginning to come around. The laws have changed in many places and the stigma has begun to fade. Canada has become the first G7 nation to completely legalize cannabis, and it's opened its public exchanges to cannabis companies. Red and blue states alike continue to pass legislation creating legal cannabis businesses, and even the federal government of the United States is showing some signs of imminent reform. This expansion of opportunity and dialing down of risk, and especially the opening of the Canadian public stock exchanges, has attracted a whole new cast of players into the industry. People who are attracted mostly or entirely by financial gain. People who have already built success in other industries. People who, for the most part, don't see a need for radical social change. Some of them consume cannabis, but many don't. And very few are familiar with the history and culture of the plant. So cannabis consumers should know the companies they buy from, how their cannabis is grown, the size of the carbon footprint, their diversity and governance, how their workers are treated, and what's being done with the profits. And then you should vote with your dollars. There's a battle going on for the soul of the cannabis industry, and every cannabis consumer plays a role in it, consciously or unconsciously. Another way to balance the increasing power of corporate cannabis is to create legal space for a small-scale, nonprofit cannabis market. Not everybody who loves cannabis feels a need to build wealth, and many cannabis people don't feel comfortable in carefully polished corporate environments. The foundation of this nonprofit sector should be legal recognition of every individual's right to grow and share their own cannabis. And these aficionados should be able to form nonprofit associations, gather in clubhouses, and share cannabis with each other. And they shouldn't be any more restricted in sharing this common interest than gun clubs and hunting clubs and wine clubs are. In Spain, more than 1,000 cannabis clubs operate this way, and most of them are way more fun than North American dispensaries. The ideas I've outlined represent just a small fraction of what's possible. As we build the global cannabis industry, everything should be on the table. Everything, whatever we can dream of. This time of new possibility and new hope is precious, and it may be fleeting. So let's cast aside our daily acceptance of the rat race. Let's open our minds and open our hearts, and together reach for the stars.